get started.
Welcome to today's webinar, Smart Growth at 25, What We Have Learned About Smart Growth Principles, hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning in association with the National Center for Smart Growth and the Smart Growth Network. My name is Michael Bayer. I'm the Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and Project Manager for the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. The Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse is a project of the Smart Growth Network, supported by the US EPA's Office of Community Revitalization and managed by the Maryland Department of Planning. In addition to hosting webinars, the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse has a website at smartgrowth.org that provides information on effective growth, development, and preservation practices. The website provides information about events, funding opportunities, awards, and resources to help local decision makers foster healthy, resilient, and economically vibrant communities. The Clearinghouse is the virtual home of the Smart Growth Network, a nationally recognized coalition of leadership organizations that have formally endorsed the principles of smart growth. This webinar is one in a series of webinars produced by the Maryland Department of Planning on smart growth and planning topics available for viewing at smartgrowth.org. This is also the second in a webinar series entitled Smart Growth at 25 with the National Center for Smart Growth, where we will address the history, principles, and implementation of smart growth, discuss what we have learned, identified issues not addressed by the original principles, and talk about where smart growth is going from here. We are recording this webinar and will be posting it on our website under the Webinar Archives tab. We encourage you to visit the website and to subscribe to our e-newsletter to learn about our upcoming webinars. You can also find out about planning initiatives, planning tools, and educational opportunities in Maryland by visiting the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov. The views expressed by the speakers in this webinar are those of the speakers and not necessarily of the Maryland Department of Planning or the state of Maryland. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association and 1.5 CNUA CEU self-reported credits from the Congress for the New Urbanism. To log your AICP credits, visit the American Planning Association's website at planning.org. Log into your account and search for the name of today's event, which is Smart Growth at 25, What We Have Learned About the Smart Growth Principles. You can also search for event number 9219023. So our speakers today are Rebecca Lewis, David Newburn, Emily Talen, and Kelly Clifton. Rebecca Lewis is an associate professor in planning, public policy, and management at the University of Oregon and co-director of the Institute of Policy Research and Engagement. Rebecca studies land use policy, transportation finance, and the nexus of land use, transportation, housing, and climate change. Her research has been published in several peer-reviewed journals and has been funded by the National Institute for Transportation and Communities, the National Science Foundation, the Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development, and the Lincoln Institute for Land Policy. David Newburn is Associate Professor at the University of Maryland in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics and is a research affiliate of the National Center for Smart Growth Research and Education. David has worked extensively on spatial models of land use change for managing residential development and has examined the effectiveness of land use policies to protect forest and farmland. He has received his doctoral degree from the University of California at Berkeley. Also, Emily Talen is Professor of Urbanism at the University of Chicago, where she teaches urban design and directs the Urbanism Lab. She has written extensively on the topics of urban design, new urbanism, and social equity. Emily's books include New Urbanism in American Planning, Design for Diversity, Urban Design Reclaimed, City Rules, and Neighborhood. She is co-editor of the Journal of Urbanism. She holds a PhD in urban geography from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and a master's in city planning from Ohio State. She is a fellow of the American Institute of Certified Planners and is a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship. Finally, Kelly Clifton serves as the Interim Associate Vice President for Research and Graduate Studies at Portland State University and is a professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Portland State. Her research, teaching, and service activities are focused on transportation and how human mobility is shaped by their needs, the built environment, and technology. She is an internationally recognized expert on transport and land use interactions, travel behavior, pedestrian modeling, and equity in transportation policy. Following their presentation, the panelists will answer as many questions as time permits. You can submit a question anytime by using the questions tool in the control panel located on the right side of your screen. And to get started, as we usually do, we're going to open with a poll, which will give you an opportunity to kind of tell us where you are visiting us from today. Where do you live and work? You have 5 options: the West, Midwest, South, Mid-Atlantic, Northeast, or International. So once we give you a few moments to respond, we'll share that and get started. If you are having any trouble with the poll, you may need to exit from full screen mode. And once we give you a few seconds to respond, we'll share that and get started. Thanks to everybody who was here today. And thanks to those who are returning from last week when we started this. And hopefully you'll be joining us for session 3, which will be next Tuesday. We are sending out the registration link shortly so that you can join us again. Give you a couple more seconds. We can see everybody responding. And I think a similar group to last time. 39% of our audience today is from the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast. 24% is from the South, 17% from the West, 12% from the Midwest, and we have 8% international audience today. And with that, I'm going to welcome Rebecca Lewis. Good afternoon, Rebecca.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us again today. For those of you that were here last week and heard our first. Great, thank you. So thank you for joining us today for this series on smart growth at 25. I'm Rebecca Lewis, and I'm one of the 3 editors of our forthcoming Smart Growth Handbook. So I'm going to give a very brief overview of kind of the background on this handbook, where this came from, and then I'll pass it off to the other 3 on the panel who were authors of some of the chapters within this book. So as my colleague Arnab Chakraborty mentioned last week, there are many publications that focus on smart growth, but many of these are focused on practice. Very few of these have focused on evaluating the principles of smart growth and the impacts of smart growth over time. Many of these are over a decade old and are somewhat narrow in scope. There are many case studies and best practices that have been compiled, many awards that have been given through organizations like the EPA's Office of Smart Growth and Smart Growth America. Some of you in the audience have likely authored or contributed to some of these resources. And there are many other plans and policy documents with the title Smart Growth. But what we attempted to do within the context of this book was try to look academically at these 10 principles and look at what was missing from smart growth originally and where the movement might go in the future. So we started as academics doing a literature review to understand what had happened along the 10 principles over the last decade. This literature review was published through the Oxford Bibliographies in Urban Studies. We published it about a year ago. We found limited and uneven impact of smart growth, declining interest in the topic over time, and a lack of clear integration with other currently popular ideas. I'll ask John to share the link to this after I finish presenting today. So we were asked by Edward Elgar to contribute to their handbook series, and this handbook is forthcoming. So it's an edited volume where we asked lots of esteemed colleagues and collaborators to author chapters that contribute to this book. And you'll be hearing from some of those authors later today. We expect it to be published in early next year by Edward Elgar Press. So the handbook is divided into 4 main components. And we're also talking through our webinars along these 4 similar platforms, as I'll talk about on the next slide. So our first webinar last week, we talked about the history, the background, the governance and policy context of this concept of smart growth. Part 2, which is the focus of today's webinar, focuses on some of the fundamental issues in implementation, focusing on the original 10 principles of smart growth that I'll remind you of in just a moment. Part 3 talks about the things that we're missing from smart growth, things like equity, resilience, energy, school choice, other sorts of things. And we'll hear from some authors next week. I'll remind you about that date later on. Part 4 is sort of trying to integrate what we learned across these chapters to chart a new course for smart growth. So we have 18 chapters within this book, including 36 authors, and the lead authors you see there, some of which are with us today. So about the webinars, last week, you can find the recording on the Smart Growth website that Michael just described. We talked about the history, concept, and governance. Today, we're going to be talking about the key themes around the 10 principles of smart growth: development, location, urban form, transportation, land use being the 3 major organizing principles. Next week, you'll hear from some other authors in the book focused on equity, workforce, public health, energy, technology. And then finally, our 4th webinar kind of synthesizes, as I said, what we've learned, thinks about charting what a new policy course might look like under a new administration. The date for that one is to be determined, but it will be go out on the listserv when we have further details about the contributors and about the date and time. So these smart growth principles you heard about last week. John Landis gave a very detailed description of the history and evolution of the concept of smart growth. And talked about these 10 principles and where they came from and how they emerged as the 10 principles that the Smart Growth Network has advocated for over this last decade or last several decades. So we're going to be hearing from authors that are focused on a few of these today. As we mentioned, we structured our book to include chapters that look at these principles over time, and I'll talk in just a moment about how those are organized. So the chapters in the book that focus on these principles, I know this is a lot of text on the slide. The green are the people you're going to be hearing from today. The other ones are other great chapters that are in the book as well. And in a moment, I'm going to very briefly give the kind of elevator version of what these book chapters said, the ones you're not hearing from today. We organize the principles and some kind of subtopics. One on the location of smart growth, which gets at principles of containment, principles of land conservation, and redevelopment. We have a set of principles that we organized focused on the form and function of smart growth, which look at the mixed use principle, urban design, which we'll hear about later, and smart growth and housing choice. And then finally, we put walkability and transportation together in this land use transportation connection and the last key theme here. So within these chapters, we asked our authors to do 5 main things. We asked them to talk about where the principle came from, whether it was an idea that had been around for a long time or was a new idea in the early 1990s when smart growth was coming into being. We asked the authors to look at the context and logic. What were the trends that the principle was designed to address? What was the logic behind the principle and the logic behind the approach? We also asked them to talk about some of the implementation tools for how governments would at different levels would realize these principles. So what were the strategies? How did these tools vary over time, space, and political jurisdiction? Which ones were successful, which ones were not, which had unexpected or undesirable consequences. We also asked them to look at the current landscape. Does the problem or issue that the principle was designed to address still exist? If not, what happened and how should we proceed moving forward? Finally, we asked them to look into the future. Is this principle still relevant? What do you see affecting this principle in the future? And what might you suggest for what we were calling Smart Growth 2.0? So given the sort of time that we have today, we couldn't hear from all of the authors. We invited a selection to kind of represent these three main topics. But I'm going to very briefly give you some of the key takeaways before I pass it off to authors from these chapters that we're not hearing from today. So the first one, the focused on compact urban design. This was a principle that existed long before smart growth. We saw it relevant in some of the first wave approaches to growth management using things like urban growth boundaries. But what our authors found was that we hadn't seen lots of large scale adoption of growth boundaries. These types of policies were still dominated by the local level. Even though that there is evidence to suggest that compact development is less expensive from a public service perspective, leads to less driving and less greenhouse gas emissions. There have been challenges in implementing this at a policy level. In the future, these authors talked about a more market-oriented perspective and there being demand for containment and compact building design from consumer cities. This, of course, has come with unintended consequences and rising housing costs that are discussed later on by the housing chapter with Casey Dawkins and Janup Kim. So Bernadette Hanlon wrote about redevelopment and talked about there being three different types of redevelopment: unutilized land, demolition, and building renovation. Populations within central cities have grown over time thanks to some policy instruments like brownfield development, renovation, and zoning reform. But there remain many challenges in the future around issues of suburban poverty, around thinking about the impacts of automobile technology and autonomous vehicles, and around responding to the pandemic. With mixed land uses, the Ansong's chapter focuses a great deal on how we measure and define mixed use. This chapter talks about how mixed use generally means less driving and increased property values, and there's many types of policies that foster land use mixing. But we need in the future better research and policy and practice to guide mixed use and to better understand the results of these policies like form-based codes, planned urban development, and new urbanism. On the housing front, this is obviously a really big topic right now. It came up a lot in our first session, and we'll continue to talk about it in our next few sessions. But the sort of principle focused here on a range of housing opportunities. One of the interesting things that the authors talked about here was that many of the tools of smart growth actually focused on what they called the extra urban reforms. So trying to expand housing choice by restricting development outside urban areas and then sort of diverting it into urban areas. But restrictive regulations remain a challenge here. So we know that affordability is moving in the wrong direction across the United States. And in the future, these authors talked about how land use regulatory reform is one tool, but not the only tool for expanding housing choice. Finally, on the notion of transportation choices, this one also sort of talks about a variety of transportation choices. Despite the sort of advocacy for this, we still see VMT rising, or have seen it rising with a few blips for the recession and for COVID. We still see transportation dominated by single occupancy vehicles, but there's been lots of new research on travel mode choice, and there are many tools that have focused on reducing auto dominance, including bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure, transit-oriented development, complete streets, and parking reform. In the future, transportation technologies will impact the sort of adoption of smart growth, and I know that Kelly will talk about that later on today. So I know that was a very high-level, brief overview of these other chapters. We encourage you to check out the book when it comes out. Today, we'll have a chance to hear in more depth about these three topics. So in just a moment, I'm going to pass it off to David, who will talk about our first topic. I want to say stay tuned for the next webinar. In this session, we're talking about these original 10 principles. Next week, we'll talk about, as I mentioned, what was missing from smart growth. We titled this third webinar Towards a More Inclusive and Resilient Smart Growth, and we'll be hearing about equity, energy, smart cities, and education and workforce from these different authors who will be talking about their chapters. So with that, I will pass it off to David. Thank you for joining us today.
Okay, well, hope you can see the screen. So I'm gonna first want to just acknowledge my co-authors. Lori Lynch is another professor in my department, and Hao-Won Wang is a PhD student working with me. So one of the main things I want to talk about is two types of development. Many people are familiar with urban, suburban development. Most people live in urban, suburban areas, and a study by Fulton, the Brookings Institute, looked at what cities sprawl the most, some more than others. And another famous study by Birchfield looked at sprawl across the United States. But again, they were looking at national land cover data showing an urban footprint from across the United States. And in that case, you get urban, which is really 1 house per acre or greater, kind of suburban urban areas that are on sewer. But those studies really miss this exurban development. And Heimlich and Anderson, which are researchers that have been at the USDA for decades, found that this rural residential development in the exurban area, large lot development, 1 acre or greater, say 1 to 10 acres, that have their own septic systems, groundwater well, that's where the majority of farmland loss, that's where the majority of forest loss and habitat fragmentation occurs. And using satellite imagery released from the Department of Defense, the exurban footprint could be picked up, and it's 10 times larger, according to the study. And there's other studies in the book, that book chapter that echo this. So we're all familiar with this kind of suburban sprawl as the city marches out into the countryside, but it is contiguous because it has to be on the sewer system, and it's also at higher density than something like this. This exurban, particularly on the lower left, you can see on 2-3 acre properties where they can kind of go anywhere where there's a rural road and a developer. My dad was a developer in Maryland for a decade, and so I worked on these properties, and this was very common. And I worked in California and Maryland and many other places, as well as the upper left. That's a picture of Colorado, and with fires going on, it's hard to do prescribed burns and let natural fires burn when you have this type of exurban development. So it's not a lot of people, but it's a lot of land. So I'm going to talk about some data we have in Baltimore to kind of use as a case study. The book chapter goes to many different areas across the country and many examples. But using this as a grounding point, what we did is we reconstructed the subdivision landscape, taking individual plat PDFs and bringing them into a GIS to look at the subdivision history from 1960 to 2008 when we started this project. And we were able to, this is manual undergraduate students putting in 5,000 hours, and I'll show you decade by decade, and concentrate, the priority funding areas are essentially the urban areas that have sewers, but there's a lot of development outside, and you have kind of Hartford on the right, Carroll on the left, and Baltimore County in the middle, and then Baltimore City is where that star is. That's kind of the area. So over time, even when zoning was adopted in the 70s and other policies like priority funding areas and so on, so we still see a lot of exurban development outside of these priority funding areas. And the book chapter, one of the things is kind of the core, this is in some ways an outline of many of the policies we discuss, is you have regulatory policies. Zoning is a kind of workhorse where there's political feasibility to do so, urban growth boundaries, incentive-based policies, PFAs, and Maryland was innovative approach and use value assessment for differential taxes for ag and rural resource properties, as well as land trusts and the kind of TDR and outright purchase, and then TDRs. And one of the main ideas is there's a different effectiveness of these land use policies for different densities, sewer versus the suburban versus exurban, and exurban is particularly challenging to manage, and it is the bigger part of the problem. So in Baltimore, coming back to Baltimore, they did adopt a pretty aggressive zoning plan in '76, and you can see, for example, the yellow is ag preservation, 1 house per 50 acres, and the RC4, which is the salmon colored, is 1 house per 5 acres around the reservoirs and drinking water supply. And then RC5 is rural residential, continuing on. And prior to 1976, it was really 1 house per acre everywhere. And when you oftentimes don't have zoning, I was a professor at Texas A&M, and there was 1 house per acre in the rural area, there was still that kind of zoning because septic requires on a minimum area to have the groundwater around septic. Now, another thing that's important to understand is the urban growth boundary was adopted here. And hopefully you can still see my screen, but the idea that that the urban growth boundary was developed in 1967, and so for about 10 years there was development in this, the growth boundary in '67, and there was a lot of this rural development, exurban development in large subdivisions going on in the rural area. Not random, but definitely a lot of it. And then it wasn't until after the zoning plan was put in that the yellow areas that are ag preserve were at least, they didn't stop development, they still have 2-acre properties that were subdivided, but most of the density was kind of channeled into the to the rural residential areas. And over time that trend continued, and this is kind of the outcome of rural residential density, taking the GIS parcel map for the entire county, taking all the residential properties and just turning number of houses divided by lot size. And you can see those red areas, those are the kind of 1 to 5 acre rural residential exurban properties. And also 5 to 20, you can see some more. And it's more inside the urban growth boundary, that's where you get the more suburban development. So in general, this is kind of the take-home messages that urban growth boundaries, where they are even applied, limit sewer service and municipal sewer service, and they're great for managing urban and suburban densities. They're an urban-suburban containment strategy, but not exurban. Exurban still, large lot development and leapfrog into the rural area. And I worked, when I was a grad student at Berkeley, worked in Sonoma County for 15 years and saw similar issues in California and Sonoma County. Ag preservation, is where the workhorse outside of in the rural area, where that was done aggressively, there was a lot of protection, but there's still going to be a certain amount of continuing rural residential. Now, turning to PFAs and the Maryland experiment, which was novel in a way to provide state funds for infrastructure in areas that were already developed. The orange areas that are the PFA limits, primarily where there was density and where they were designated based on where sewer services are along the Baltimore-Washington corridor and a few regional cities. And a study by Rebecca Lewis and Garrett Knapp in JAPA showed that in many ways that they didn't really move the trend, that the upper line shows that outside of their PFAs, there's mainly these large lot development, 2 acres per home. And then inside the PFA, there was, quarter acre lots before and after. And 3 times more land is occurring outside the PFAs, and 3 times more people live inside. So but the PFA had a limited impact because, they are different. PFA is this kind of novel incentive-based approach. UGBs are regulatory. That said, PFAs are actually similar to UGBs because both are designated on existing sewer service, existing density. And so it's an urban-suburban containment. It does not directly impact the exurban large lot. And PFAs have also not moved that much. They have not been redesignated and moved out over time since 1997. So they effectively have been like a sewer service limit, and that's been there. And there's a next generation to address that. Now, if we move to the land conservation movement, most of the land is in these 4 big federal agencies, out in the West and Alaska, and much of it's pre-1990. But if we look at the last 25 years of smart growth, land trusts have grown exceptionally. If you look at conservation easements, you're looking at 793,000 acres to 13.3 million. That's a 15-fold increase just in this 20-year period, and it was continuing on. Now, land trusts, obviously, the tax incentives for donating easements have fueled this dramatic increase. And programs, land trusts often report success based on number of acres, bucks per acre, or tax incentives in this case. That said, tax incentives, Parker and Thurman found that tax incentives often target parcels with the highest tax deduction instead of those with the highest benefit cost ratios, benefits for the public. And land trusts could be more selective, rejecting some that don't have as high benefits, but they often want to protect as much land as possible. Taxpayers, not the land trust, are those affected by the foregone taxes when the donated easement. Now, I won't say much about TDRs, except there have been many attempts, 191, but most have generated limited trading. As an economist, I should be, in favor of market-based approaches, and they do have potential, but there's only been a limited number of cases that have been successful, and even the 350,000 acres that have been protected in this prior study, that's dwarfed by 13 million acres in conservation easements. And lack of demand in the receiving areas is challenging. You have to have optimal density that's even higher than the current zoning in receiving areas, which is really challenging in urban areas. There's been some success in ex-urban areas more than urban areas as a receiving zone. Now, if we kind of move to the future, but in many ways, people recognize this, is that we really have to look at three, rather than just urban, rural, as two areas. That the urban areas, obviously, the areas that are planned existing sewers, growth management. You don't even need a UGB, just how you plan sewers and sewer infrastructure is going to determine where you get urban suburban growth. And in the rural region, we're going to, where we have contiguous farmland and forests and wetlands, using a synergistic policy, zoning where it's acceptable, easements as well, and use value assessment. But there's going to be areas we can't protect everywhere in the rural area, so there's going to be these sacrifice zones. There is historic zoning, and we could even densify there. Some of the TDR programs that were successful densified there. And this is the next generation after the PFAs, which is the Septic Law, which mirrors these three regions, which is that tier 1 and 2 is where existing and planned sewers are. Tier 4 is those green areas that are that now there's this downzoning policy that restricts any kind of major large subdivision out there. And tier 3 is business as usual, meaning there's still the existing zoning, all the existing rules are there, but they're just not going to layer another layer of a regulatory approach. And those, this is just Baltimore County, but if we take it at state level, the kind of green versus yellow areas, the yellow areas are the sacrifice zones where we could possibly densify, as well as shifting areas into the urban areas. But this is at least the newest after the PFA, Maryland's attempt to address this. So at that point, I'm going to turn it over to Emily. I'm done.
Okay, thanks, David. All right, I am going to attempt to share my screen. Okay. Okay, hopefully everybody can see my slides here, but not me, which is just fine. So this is going to be a very, very different kind of scale and kind of presentation, which I guess is speaks to the complexity of what we mean by smart growth. But my topic in the book was about urban design and urban design and what it has to do with smart growth. Urban design is about engaging with the physical, material side of cities and trying to be proactive about that and trying to shape cities and their component parts in ways that meet objectives, which are aesthetic, social, environmental, economic. And I think it's important to note that urban design can mean a lot of different things and have very different motivations. But for smart growth, I would argue that there are some very specific normative goals that are especially relevant to smart growth. So in other words, it's good urban design when it comes to smart growth is not anything. And I think it's, so that's one of the things I'm going to briefly talk about. I'll just put up my second slide here. I segmented my chapter into these 4 parts. First, kind of reviewing those normative principles. Secondly, talking about the urban design process that's involved, then some implementation matters, and then progress to date. So on the principles front, it's really all about walkability. It's about neighborhoods that are walkable and compact and socially diverse. It's about prioritizing land use mix and what the design requirements of that might be. It's about having good proximity between what you need in your daily life and where you live, and looking at connections in all kinds of fundamental ways. Then the requirements for density and parking and traffic, all of that being dealt with in a way that prioritizes walkability and pedestrian access. So you can see that the images on the left there are kind of what we've been going for in the smart growth community, and the images on the right signifying some decades where we, prior to thinking about these things, where we were obviously prioritizing cars and not walkability. So that is really, in a nutshell, what the urban design requirements of smart growth are. Now, that's all well and good, but you have to nuance that. And what walkability is in one context might look very different in another context. And the concept that I find very helpful for thinking through these different nuances and how things change according to scale and according to density is the Transect. And the Transect is just a kind of conceptual tool that we use to think about places that are very urban versus places that are more rural, and everything in between, and kind of thinking through, well, how would the urban design requirements for walkability and compactness and social diversity and all the things we're going for, how would that vary according to where you are on this conceptual transect, from being more urban to more rural. And so there's a lot of interesting work that's been done trying to ferret all of that out and what that means in terms of urban design, and actually how you code all of that is really important as well. I think the main point I'm trying to make here is that even though there are these normative principles about urban design and what we're going for, it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of situation, which is often the critique. Design principles absolutely need to be articulated differently depending on the particulars of place. So getting to this issue of the fundamental issue of process. Urban design is never about end state blueprints. It certainly shouldn't be. It involves a process for getting there. And that process is resident generated, it's participatory design, it's emphasizing alternatives, emphasizing the creation of alternatives. Now, you can do all that and still, as an urban designer, hold true to your principles of good urban design, prioritizing walkability and all the urban design principles that I just talked about. Being process-oriented, though, means that there's more than one way of looking at a problem, and there's more than one solution. And it also means that there is value actually in the process of coming together, getting the residents to join together in crafting urban design principles that make sense for their particular community. So it's a local, place-based kind of process. The next topic in my chapter was about implementation. Okay, so you've got your principles and you're going to nuance them, maybe according to the Transect, and then you have this resident-driven process to actually formulate urban design standards and what it is you're going for, maybe a visionary plan of some sort. But how are you going to implement what you come up with? In urban design, it's really about where is your investment going, either a public investment in particular. What funds are you directing to what as you change the urban environment? And then secondly, the big category here is coding. And that's about regulating the what happens in the private world. So what you want to do is ensure that the rules that guide private development are supportive of these key objectives. And that really involves coming up with a kind of operating system. Now, I bet everyone on this webinar knows about form-based codes, but I will just reiterate that I think form-based coding is actually the way to go in terms of trying to implement these walkable urban design concepts that I was talking about. How are you going to get those interjected into our regulatory environment? And form-based coding is a great way to go. I noticed that the Form-Based Codes Institute is now part of Smart Growth America, so smart growth and form-based coding are certainly interacting in positive ways. And I happened to pick a screenshot here of the Form-Based Codes Institute being very promoting of virtual engagement and how that has become really important. That's pretty interesting. A little self-promotion here. I just published this article on tracking form-based codes across the US and trying to think about what is the socioeconomic context of those codes. You will have to read the paper to know, but the upshot was that I didn't see evidence that form-based codes are somehow associated with gentrification and being, exclusionary in any way. That's what my data found anyway. Okay, so now the last topic I'm going to talk about is, well, how are we doing? Progress to date. On the one hand, we do have a great collection of information now, and this paper is already 5 years old, more 6, 7 years old, on all the studies that have been done about the benefits of these well-designed smart growth compatible kind of neighborhoods. They're walkable, they're compact, they're socially diverse. We know that there is extensive evidence that this is good for you. It's good for your health, it's good for economics, it's good for environmental goals that we have, all that good stuff. But yet, if you really think about who's actually living in these walkable, diverse, compact neighborhoods, this statistic I'm showing you here is a little bit dated, but we haven't been doing that great. I mean, the US overall, I'm sure less than 10% of us are living in walkable neighborhoods. And I just happen to use this metric of walk score that you might be familiar with. There's other ways to measure it, but we have a long way to go. And I just want to close by pointing out that there are real tensions going on. This is what I see, and you probably all are very familiar with this in your own locales. Tensions involved in the effort to advance good urban design for the achievement of smart growth and the ability to actually access that. So there's a lot of agreement on how wonderful, walkable, compact, diverse neighborhoods can be. That's great urban design, but it's just not being spread fair enough. And so what's been happening is a lot of the effort is seen as undermining some neighborhoods rather than being a positive kind of force. And so should these urban design qualities that we've been talking about, what should we do if they stimulate displacement? What should we do if public realm investment like pedestrian upgrades is prioritized over urgent matters about public health? So in the years ahead, I think as we try to take these urban design principles to the street and in pursuit of better growth, smarter growth, we're really going to have to grapple with the degree to which these tensions can be dealt with and can be rectified. So the end goal is we want the benefits of well-designed cities and neighborhoods to be more equally shared, and we want this, and this is a fundamental task of urban design for smart growth. Thank you. Let's see, I am turning it over to Kelly.
Thank you, Emily. And you've done a great job of sort of setting up my presentation here, which is about creating walkable neighborhoods. And I think the interesting thing about walkable neighborhoods is it intersects with all the other principles so very clearly and fundamentally. So in terms of talking about progress, when we look across the other principles and where they stand, it's a great indicator of where we are in terms of walkability. And you know, the thing about walking is it's a form of locomotion that is inherently human, but yet we really seem to be challenged in how to consider it in our planning and policy. And walkable neighborhoods are not just about utilitarian travel, they're also about offering recreational opportunities. They are places with social and economic vitality, and hopefully they are equitable and accessible. And so over the 25 years of smart growth policy, the interest in walking, and I should say cycling as well, has increased quite a bit by the public. The public seems to want more walkable spaces, but it's not without challenges, like I said, and not without contention in some spaces, as Emily pointed out. So briefly, what I'm going to talk about is just, and very briefly, what have we done? How have we fared, and where should we go? So in terms of walkable environments, I see this as sort of three categories that we are concerned with. So one is taking back those places that were designed around walkability historically, but have been transformed to accommodate the automobile. So urban centers, city centers, historic small towns, and so on. The second domain is about retrofitting suburban environments that have largely ignored and excluded pedestrians. And so I think this is one of our biggest challenges is how can we go back and redesign and retrofit those spaces to make them more walkable. And then finally, incorporation of pedestrians into our new urban growth. And I think that's where a lot of the new urbanism attempted to try to think about walking and pedestrians. And so it's not, these are not the same challenge across these different types of urban spaces, and have different socioeconomic implications as well. So I guess I should say that, let me go back. I should say that in the research realm, there's been a lot of discussion over these 25 years about what is the impact of changing the built environment in terms of travel behavior, in terms of mode shifts, in terms of getting more people to walk. And then also one of the key policy initiatives around this had to do with health. So, and there it was really about behavioral change. So one was about the built environment change leading to behavioral change, and then within the health domain, thinking about how can we get people to think differently about walking, what are their attitudes and perceptions, and what is the role of the built environment. And one of the things that have challenged academics is translating our results for practitioners. So every time there's a model and someone gives you an elasticity, I think that practitioners don't know what to do with that. And that's, I think, one thing that still persists, that we as academics could do a better job of packaging our results and translating them. So over these 25 years, there has been great advances in data. So we have spatially and temporally explicit data. We are able to incorporate this into geographic information systems. And this has led to a great ability to measure the environment, to measure the amount of walking that people are doing, and then ultimately model and forecast behavior. And so in the beginning of these walkability measures, being able to just capture land use change, density change, land use mix at a very disaggregate level was critical to understanding walkability across our urban spaces. And then to complement that, there is a fair amount of work on walkability audits, and earlier on in my career, I did some of these, and there's been a great advances by others here. And this was really to capture those very fine-grained qualities of the built environment, and are fairly labor-intensive, but there was a lot of work there. And then through these two data sources, there are a number of indices that were then used to characterize walkability. And so Emily just mentioned Walk Score, which has been used primarily as a real estate tool. So it does indicate the degree to which people are interested in buying into walkable neighborhoods. And then to complement this, we have had better resolution on pedestrian behaviors. So these household travel surveys that form the backbone of our regional travel demand models, but are also used for a lot of policy and planning, have incorporated pedestrians and asked more pointed questions about biking and pedestrian behavior. There has been widespread initiatives to count pedestrians, and that has been facilitated by technology. And then also being able to have detailed spatial resolution on pedestrian crashes. And again, all of these data about routes and behaviors have all been advanced by wearable technology and our cell phones. And so all of this has allowed us to be more sophisticated with modeling and forecasting. Why is that important? Well, for a couple of reasons. If pedestrians aren't included in these regional models, then they're not included. So those trips that are predicted get allocated to other modes and inflate the demand for those other modes. And then also then just using this as a tool to understand then the relationship between built environment change and walking, and to be able to model the health and safety impact. So this is another innovation that's been happening in our measures and tools, is an interest in understanding what are the health outcomes of having more walkable neighborhoods. Then in terms of policy and programs, so in terms of building pedestrian infrastructure and supports, the federal funding, and starting with ICE-T, really transformed the ability for cities to have access to money to build this kind of infrastructure. And so we see that federal pedestrian and bicycle spending went from 22 million in 1992 to 916 million in 2018. So while that is a huge change in terms of federal funding available, this is still only 2% of federal transportation spending. So great gains, but still relatively small in the transportation realm. And then local governments are really bearing the brunt of implementing these policies and building pedestrian infrastructure. And so funding remains a huge challenge. And I think the other thing about understanding how effective these policies are, I can only really express this in terms of dollars, because we still don't have a mechanism to look very carefully at this very detailed kinds of investments happening across the United States in terms of miles of pedestrian infrastructure, for example. That those kinds of metrics just don't exist. The other authors of this handbook can talk about land use change. So again, as Emily said, you know, the urban design is really focused on walkability, and I would argue that a lot of the other aspects of the built environment also center on walkability. So I won't talk about so much about this other than that density mix planning for accessibility has been important and has been, there's been important changes in many places to the zoning code to allow for more positive land use change with respect to walkability. And then finally, the last policy and program that we've seen has to do with transportation demand management. And I would say that these are the kinds of carrots and sticks that lead to travel behavior change or changes in investments. And I would say the one that's been the most important has probably been around parking. But this is the least understood. So as a researcher, this is the question that practitioners want to know is if we give transit passes to residents of residential neighborhoods, how much bang for the buck do we get there? And I think that this is a tool that is not utilized as well as it could be, but also our understanding isn't so clear. So in terms of progress, so I think the good news is that walkable neighborhoods have become highly desirable places to be, and that we have at least more funding and tools available to try to implement change than we did 25 years ago. So again, we see this with the permissive zoning policies that Minneapolis, the state of Oregon, just implemented in terms of residential policies that make it easier to build more densely. I also think that health has been a very strong motivator for the public. So framing walkability around transportation is often a less popular or failing political framework, but framing it around health and livability is much more positive. And as Americans, our obsession with fitness, whether we actually achieve it or not, is not clear. But health has been a very strong motivator in getting people to walk more. On the downside, though, there are incredible demographic and spatial inequities around walkability. So communities of color and the poor live in places that are less walkable, or if they live in places that are walkable, gentrification makes that less affordable for them. There's also, for those same communities, extreme accessibility and safety issues. So where we see the most pedestrian safety, pedestrian crashes happen to be in those same neighborhoods. So highly segregated areas in terms of where, if you look at what's walkable and what's not, you can also follow other kinds of inequitable trends. Funding remains a persistent challenge in creating these neighborhoods or in creating these places. And I think one of the biggest challenges that I think we're going to see is thinking about planning for destinations. So in maybe an overzealous attempt to create mixed use, many cities have oversupplied retail space. And then the threats of e-commerce has sort of diminished then the ability to create local destinations to walk to. So what does that mean for walking for utilitarian purposes? The automobile still dominates most of our urban landscape, and particularly in the suburbs. So we have a long way to go in terms of achieving this transformation. And then pedestrian deaths and injuries in 2019, they were the highest in 3 decades. And they've increased 53% since 2009. So that's not a positive metric. Now, part of the reason why those may have increased is that more people are walking, but also means that more people are driving. So we're trying to do it all instead of shifting modes. So looking ahead, walking is going to be the critical component of a smart growth agenda, if not the most important component. Climate change, I think, is going to be the overarching policy issue that frames our movement forward, and safety and equity will be included there. I think one of the things that we need to consider is journeys over the entire course. So we spend a lot of time talking about first and last mile. And I think when we start thinking about climate change and we start considering people with different abilities or disabilities, the first and last feet are going to be important to think about. And then also indoor environments. So we are thinking about transforming our outdoor spaces, our outdoor built environment. But as we start to see extreme temperatures, and here in Portland, we had a phenomenal 116 degrees a couple weeks ago. How do we think about our indoor environments, providing spaces for mobility? Walking is going to be fundamental to all of our modes, has always been fundamental to all of our modes. And so again, more attention to how it integrates, and we have seamless ability to move throughout our cities with walking, high level of accommodation of walking everywhere. And then finally, technology poses a lot of opportunities. So the promise of autonomous vehicles providing a safer environment for pedestrians also has some downfalls in terms of continuing to invest in the automobile as a primary mode of transportation. We also see, as we are investing in other forms of micromobility, like e-bikes or scooters, that those have incredible conflicts with pedestrians. So thinking very carefully about where this goes in the future and where our priorities are going to be key. And then finally, as we come out of COVID, what's going to be different and what's going to remain the same? And so we saw an incredible amount of revitalization here in Portland. We've closed a lot of streets. There's a lot more outdoor dining. People were walking for recreation. Will that continue, and will people be able to walk for utilitarian purposes? So I really like this quote from Rebecca Solnit, talking about walking as an indicator species, and really the outcome. Walking could be considered a measure of success for all of the smart growth principles. So if we're doing it right and we're able to track how much people are walking, it can tell us very much about how we're doing in the health of the system. So thank you very much. We're going to switch to some Q&A now, and so all of the panelists will have an opportunity to answer your questions.
Great, thanks, Kelly, and thanks to everybody who has submitted questions so far. We apologize. We were having some minor technical issues with screen share. We didn't notice anything on our end, but if you ever run into that, you may need to refresh your webcast. So we're going to ask our panelists if they can turn their cameras on so we can see them during the Q&A. And as usual, you can continue to submit the questions, and we'll go through this Q&A till about 2:30 Eastern, so a little bit more than 25 minutes here. And thanks to everybody for sending those in. And thanks to John Coleman, who's working with me on the technical side here. Okay, so I guess, and it's given the wide range of area that we covered during the presentation, the questions also cover quite a wide area. We're often much more focused in terms of the topic, but this one is pretty broad today. So I'm going to just toss these out to the panelists, and you all can respond to them. In the cases where they were directed to a particular panelist, I will try to send it to you, but others can also add to the response as well. So I guess I'll start early on when I guess David was speaking about some of the work in Maryland, and we have a question from Peter Hagar, who was asking, have there been correlations to the exurban septic and Chesapeake Bay groundwater quality issues that you talked about?
Yeah, I work on the Baltimore Ecosystem Study, which is a long-term National Science Foundation, and with that, there's been dozens of scientists working. We were brought in, they've been working since 1998, and many of them had found that exurban has much larger nitrogen loads, and that's for the septic tanks actually don't process as much nitrogen as, say, a municipal wastewater treatment. In fact, around 8 times more per household, about 8 times more, 4 to 8 times more nitrogen. So we are seeing that we're working on a series of projects regarding Chesapeake Bay water quality, and that's one of the reasons, the motivation for that septic law. As well as other things like large lawns. We're looking at lawn fertilizer and other things, but there are numerous impacts from exurban.
Great, thank you. Next question here is from Cray Roggenkamp, who is asking, I'm curious what the speakers make of new technologies. Fighting over septic assumes ancient technology, i.e. nitrate dilution or another metric. And we now have individual and neighborhood scale treatment systems that produce high quality wastewater. Regulating by technology won't work anymore.
I guess the thing about septic is not that the septic, I mean, I just mentioned septic as being a problem, but the idea that if you create sewers in most cities, when we look down and we see an urban footprint, and even like Emily's slide where she showed where she was working, you saw those black spots of where her code, you know, the project, the land use and urban planning article, and you see that black, that's the 2% that's urban. All the other places, there are far away from septic. I mean, far away from those cities where there's sewers. All that other land, much of it is vulnerable. So the exurban zone at which you can build is anywhere where you can drive out into the countryside and put down homes. What allows the homes to be built there is that they can have their own septic system. It's not the septic by itself, but the septic allows you to move outside of cities. And that's 98% of our country. So much of it is very, very far away from anything, or maybe it's under federal lands or whatever, but the septic area, the zone of influence, is enormous compared to suburban. We just think of, oh, suburban chewing farmland off at the edge of a city, but that's small in comparison. And you know, a 5-acre lot, you're not typically farming anymore. And even for the biodiversity impact, a lot of studies out in Colorado and elsewhere, and I worked with conservation biologists in Sonoma County, where the impact goes out hundreds of meters because of invasive species, because the cats will roam out of the house, numerous things. So the impact on biodiversity and else thing is such that those fragmented landscapes have big impacts, as well as we're seeing with wildfire prevention. I mean, Sonoma County, the suburban area got impacted, 600 homes, but now with all these wildfires, all these exurban homes, it really makes it difficult for firefighters to get out there and prevent and do their job.
Okay, thanks, David. Your next question here is for Emily. Are there any conformance-based plan evaluations to gauge implementation of smart growth principles?
I don't know if that is the best question for me. Rebecca, you have some thoughts on that? I'm going to punt on that one.
That's an interesting question. I think one of the things that we notice in the literature, both in the annotated bibliography and through reading all these chapters, is there are, you know, the principles are not always what the policies relate to. So even Maryland Smart Growth Program is more about priority funding areas and where growth is going, and less about, you know, urban design and walkability and mix of housing and mix of transportation. So when you think about, you know, what we're designating as smart growth, it becomes really difficult to evaluate smart growth policies from the perspective of the principles, because not all of them are about the principles. And that was definitely something that came out, I think, in the mixed use chapter as well. Mixed use is one of the principles that I think people think about as, you know, smart growth is about mixed use and compact development, but really trying to gauge the impact of that. And gauge, I think, to Emily's point, even when you start to think about what are the impacts on, the principle talks about sense of place. How do you measure sense of place? It becomes really difficult to measure the impact. So I don't know if that addresses the question, but that was one of the barriers we saw to doing this work, is trying to understand those impacts when they're not quantitative.
Yeah, and I guess I would just argue also, when we look at, you know, how effective has Portland area's urban growth boundary, how do you pick a comparator? So we're really just tracking and benchmarking change in one place over time, but we don't know really how that would compare to the counterfactual. So, you know, I think this is another challenge, because there aren't good comparing priority funding areas to urban growth boundaries only gets you so far in terms of looking at the effectiveness of the policy.
Okay, thanks, Kelly. Next question here is, how can we ensure the urban design guidelines are inclusive? How do we make sure they will respond to the needs and desires of the whole community, as opposed to only the handful of people who show up at charrettes?
Good question. That comes up a lot. I mean, as planners, it's our responsibility to be inclusive, and often a community engagement process will get hijacked by a minority of voices. I don't know if it's often, but it certainly does happen. And in Chicago, where I live, it does happen quite frequently that people will come out and they're just opposed to any kind of change. So, I mean, there's strategies that you can use to try to have an inclusive process that doesn't get hijacked by people that have narrow interests. And here I want to really plug the Charrette Institute, because they have this down to a science of really figuring out different strategies through a charrette process of making sure everything's inclusive. Like, I'll just give you a simple example. One strategy is at a meeting, the youngest person in the room gets to talk first, and you just kind of go up the ladder. And then, having it be a multi-day kind of event where you make sure you get a lot of different people streaming in, making sure you provide daycare so that you get a more representative sample, not just the retirees who have all the time in the world. There are strategies, and it takes effort on the part of urban designers and urban planners to make sure they are being inclusive and that they're not being necessarily hijacked by minority interests.
Okay, thanks, Emily. Next question here is from Laura Buell, who's asking, and makes a comment first. People say they want walkable environments, but in my experience, they usually aren't willing to give up any automobile infrastructure, which is necessary to achieve walkability. Even self-described environmentalists are reticent to remake our urban spaces for people. Do you have any suggestions on how to deal with this?
I mean, I think that this is going to be an issue about sort of education, but I also think that in many of our efforts in transportation, we don't actually advocate in practice. So, we, unlike other countries, don't advertise taking transit over driving, right? We hold choice as the sort of supreme American principle. And I think that we as planners are going to have to say, we're going to have to put value judgments on these modes because we cannot have it both ways. So do I know how to accomplish this in practice and how we build the political will for that? I'm not sure, but I think that the one potential is leveraging this moment we're in now around severe climate events and severe weather events to sort of try to use that as an inflection point to change public will. And I think also some of it is going to have to be using more sticks than carrots. So I hate to raise the word pricing, but that's going to have to be part of our strategy as well.
Yeah, I mean, isn't this one of the fundamental things about smart growth is you're trying to make, if people are opting for certain behaviors that are detrimental to the environment, that they want to have it all. They want to have their cars, but they also want to be able to access things, that we need to make sure that those costs are being distributed in a way that reflects our values. So if you are going to sprawl, there's a cost for that, and right now, in a lot of places around the country, I think David and Kelly and Rebecca can speak to this better than me, but there are no costs. There aren't really costs to wanting to do it all, and or to trying to do it all. And then the other thing, and that's sort of the stick part, but the other thing is the carrot part is really making sure people see the benefits of getting out of their car and what they have to gain by doing that. Maybe people can be made more aware of those benefits in certain ways.
And I guess I would just also follow, like, walkability is one thing that I think people are fairly willing to get behind, but transit is another, and transit's really suffering as we come out of COVID. And I don't think that we can recover transit without the car bearing those costs.
But I think I'll add in to extend what Kelly and Emily said. I think, you know, smart growth emerged as this sort of, instead of it being around sort of saying no to sprawl or being so antagonistic to development interests, it was around trying to accommodate a different style of development. And it was this new vernacular, of new way of talking about things. And those principles reflect the housing choice and the transportation choice. But at the same time, like Kelly and Emily are saying, there is this sort of notion of wanting to have it all, wanting to use incentives instead of regulations, I think is the other piece that's really sort of affects how this movement has proceeded over time. And so I think that what we're seeing is the incentives maybe didn't go far enough. And so we need to move further on the pricing and move further on the bearing the brunt of those impacts and bearing the full costs. And we'll talk more about that in the next webinar, but there are a lot of things that weren't included at all. And then other things I think that didn't probably go far enough, where maybe we're too soft and too passive in our approach with some of these incentives, too inclusive of having all transportation modes and all housing types, such that we really haven't seen movement on those dominant types. And so I think those are really interesting questions to keep considering.
Okay, we got a couple questions asking about the name of the institute that you mentioned that uses science for inclusive engagement. Can you repeat that?
Oh, the Charette Institute. It's actually run out of Michigan State University these days. And there's a Charette Handbook, and you know, these folks have been at it for a really long time, and that's why I really trust them, because they know what they're doing. Email me if you can't find it, but it should come right up.
Okay, and we can share that link with folks in the chat as well. Okay, next question here is, at the municipal scale rather than neighborhood scale, are there measures of walkability that could be used to benchmark performance over time? In other words, if a suburban municipality or a researcher for that matter wants to compare municipal level walkability, making comparisons across cities or across time, does something like a city level walk score exist?
Not that I'm aware of, but I think we could certainly spatially aggregate some of those walk score measures into a metropolitan measure.
I think the walk score folks have such metrics, like they'll come out with a ranking of, you know, Boston is the most walkable city, and, you know, they're doing some kind of aggregation.
But I think the question is that the right scale? Because even within the metropolitan area, there are huge disparities spatially and demographically. So if you really want to elevate walking, and particularly thinking about the least advantaged, those aggregate scores are going to average out those inequities. And so I think it would be better to look at your lowest scoring walk score locations and invest in those, perhaps.
Yeah.
Great, thanks. We just sent out the link to the Charette Institute, and some folks also have shared it on the questions tab. So I think folks are familiar with that.
Yeah, the other thing I just noticed is that you put my email in the chat, but it's my first initial is supposed to be there, so you can see that. Well, it says Newburn at umd.edu, but it's actually D Newburn. But anyway, so I think it's
Got that. Yeah, so you folks in the audience use his email that's on the screen and not in the chat. We got a comment which I'll just pass along to Emily here, who just said from Jacqueline Furtado, who says, I don't have a question, but I want to personally thank Dr. Talen for her work with the Plan Medicine AICP courses. I passed in May, and listening to her here gives me warm and fuzzy feelings. Her voice is very instrumental to my success. So just wanted to
Yay! Yay, I'm so glad you passed. Congratulations. It's a tough one.
It is definitely something that planners kind of deal with there. Next question here, are some solutions to walkability safety issues and conflicts, what are some solutions to walkability safety issues and conflicts with pedestrians and bicycles, scooters, skateboards, etc.?
Yeah, I think that this issue of how we allocate, oh, am I muted? Yep. How we allocate space to the right of way is going to be a critical design issue for transportation. So if we're specifically, I think historically we've been thinking about, how the automobile contributes to lack of pedestrian safety. And so as we start to see electrification of micromobility, where scooters and bikes are going to be operating at higher speeds, we're going to have to think about this more carefully in terms of, for example, what goes into the bike lane, how do we create protected spaces for all those modes. I think it's the next challenge. I do spend, for the last 3 years, I've spent a large chunk of time in Munich, where they put the bicycle infrastructure often on the sidewalk. And so as a pedestrian, I find that to be maybe not the best choice, but cyclists think it's great because they're separated from the automobile. So I think there's going to be a fair amount of sort of contention over this allocation of street space. But I think this is another one of those ways that we can think about shifting away from the automobile and just giving less and less of our street right of way to cars, and thinking more and more about how that space gets allocated to scooters and bikes and other forms of electric vehicles that are going to come and be smaller and more adaptable. So I think that's the primary mechanism, is a spatial one.
Thanks, Kelly. Next question here is from Katie Lacey, who says, how can affordable housing advocates respond when smart growth principles around conservation, energy, mixed use get used by NIMBY groups to fight denser, more affordable multifamily housing?
I have a comment there. I'm sorry, let me at least make one comment, which is that in our study area in Baltimore region, one of the things that one of our colleagues found was that the times at which developers have to wait to get through the approval process affects where they develop. And actually, because developing in urban areas, you have oftentimes, especially larger projects compared to a 3 or 4 acre subdivision in a rural area, the times to go through the planning process were shorter in the rural area compared to the urban area. And that actually, he found, it exacerbated sprawl. So one of the suggestions that came through that is to allocate more people in the urban area for the permit approval process. It's still going to take a while, but if you allocate more staff, then you can even cut off a few months of approval time possibly. And that is one of the issues that at least is in the control of staffing agencies, to allocate less people in the rural area, make it take longer in the rural area, because that's one of the things that was contributing greatly to sprawl in our region.
I guess I would also add that in my work, not presented here, but I've done a fair amount of work on how we evaluate the transportation impacts of new development, including affordable housing. And historically, we've relied on the Institute of Transportation Engineers trip generation to evaluate how much automobile traffic will be generated from a new development. And those data, I think, are fundamentally flawed. I don't think, I have a lot of evidence to show that they're fundamentally flawed. They're 100% auto-oriented. You can't differentiate for socioeconomics. You can't differentiate for the urban context of new development. And so those data and the arguments that come out of it have been successfully used by NIMBY groups to block multifamily housing in general and affordable housing specifically. And so if we look at the objective travel data, people who live in affordable housing or any kind of multifamily housing are making far fewer trips than would be predicted by these data. So I think one of the fundamental changes that needs to happen is that cities need to stop mandating and promoting the use of trip generation data and level of service methods that are about traffic delay, in the evaluation of new development.
Thank you. We have a couple more minutes here, so we'll ask a couple more and then we'll go to our wrap up for closing thoughts. Next question, I guess, is based on what David was saying earlier. As David indicated, the protection of rural areas has been fairly successful due to Maryland's smart growth principles. This may be due to the fact that this was relatively inexpensive compared to the cost of creating smart communities. Preserving 10 acres of rural land is cheaper compared to preserving 1 acre of urban parkland. Similarly, protecting communities from gentrification and protecting urban tree canopies are expensive and controversial. What financial tools do the panelists see as available to remedy this in the future?
Say it again. I'm sorry. I'm trying to. There's lots there, and I'm just trying to. Can you maybe repeat that a bit, just to, or summarize it really quickly? Because
sure. I think they were looking for financial tools that are available to remedy this, the cost differential between preserving rural areas versus urban parkland and preserving tree canopy. Are there kind of tools that can be used to rectify this?
Well, one thing is that in general, if land is more expensive, I mean, conservation organizations compete in the market, and to some extent, it's always going to be cheaper to buy rural properties. Not only that, they tend to be more contiguous. So for habitat and those kind of goals, or protecting farmland, protecting in the rural area is where most of the activity happens, and that is more efficient. That said, you need a lot of open space, but that has to provide not just it has to provide more the amenities to, there's more people living in an urban area, so it justifies spending more in those places where that area will be used a lot. Now, as far as the mechanism, you know, one thing is trying to get tree cover in residential areas. And one area that I think is really missed in these ex-urban areas is that people maybe have 5 acres, and that we could pay someone to convert 2 acres of their, you know, they have a 5-acre lawn, maybe plant the back 2 acres into trees, and we end up spending lots of money on individual trees in the city, and that might be fine, but the truth is, if you're trying to do like heat island effects to some extent, you want to deal with the ex-urban area as well, because it's at a larger level that you're going to impact these areas. So I think there hasn't been as much effort to do lawn conversion in rural areas. And there's opportunity for that, as well as everything that people have been doing to promote urban cover, but that's people more aware of that.
I'll just add very briefly, I know there are some land conservation organizations in the Northwest, in Seattle in particular, that have started to invest in affordable housing and not just trying to conserve rural areas, in the sense that it kind of goes back to one of the points I was making out of Casey Dawkins' chapter, which is many of the smart growth tools focused on where we don't want to grow, meaning our rural areas, and trying to prevent development there, but focus less on how we do development on the inner core. The same criticism has applied to Oregon's famous urban growth boundaries as well. We focus so much on the outside and so little on the inside. But I think we are starting to move in a different direction and starting to see these nonprofits and policy instruments focus more on the quality of development inside, which aligns with a lot of what Emily and Kelly have been saying today. So less on the financial side, but more our financial instrument side, but more on some sort of other innovative ways to think about this.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. I guess one last question, kind of timely here, given where we are in the pandemic. The COVID pandemic saw people flee the suburbs for suburban and rural areas. Do you see that this is a temporary trend? Now distance working at home seems possible. This might reduce car usage, but possibly increase demand for more single-family detached houses, possibly on septic systems. How do you see the future, and are our preservation tools adequate? For smart growth, I don't think we anticipated that distance from work could have impact on increasing demand for single-family detached lifestyles.
Yeah, I would think that with COVID and the remote work, that there will be more demand for ex-urban areas. and that while people will come back to some degree, will not come back to a pre-pandemic level. So those planning in that region will be more important. Kelly, you have something to say?
Well, I mean, this is always the question, right? Of are cities dying, and are we gonna, you know, the desire for suburban living? What does it look like in the future? And so, I don't know, but I know that now that we are coming out of the pandemic, people are congregating in cities more than ever. So I don't know how, over the long term, this sort of expansion and contraction in terms of what lifestyle people want. I just know that now that we're coming out, you know, you see people gathering in all those spaces that were empty in the pandemic. I also say the real estate market says that cities are very strong.
Yeah, I want to underscore that as well. There's a lot of movement with people and the tech workers who can now live in wherever, but they're moving to places that have strong sense of community and walkability. And actually, this is driving up prices in walkable neighborhoods. That's the data I've seen.
Great, thanks, Emily. And I'll say thanks to the audience again. We actually got a good number of good questions here at the end, but I think we've run out of time. And given that this is a multi-part webinar series, we'll be able to share these with the panelists and the other panelists as they consider not only session 3, which is Tuesday, we sent the link out already during the chat and in the email today, but also for session 4, kind of wrapping up and looking forward. So with that, I think I'd just ask each of the panelists to give us some closing thoughts, and we'll go in the reverse order of our panelists today, and maybe start with Kelly.
Thank you. Well, I think that we've sort of established that climate change and equity are going to be the imperative of smart growth in the next 25 years. And I think walking is going to be a central principle, if not the primary principle, organizing all of the other aspects of smart growth. And so again, I think Rebecca Solnit's quote is a nice one to end on, that if pedestrians are indicator species of the health and vitality of our planet, then we need to do a better job of measuring them. And I guess the other thing I say is, you know, we have been walking and creating walkable environments since the beginning of cities. So a lot of our future is going to be about looking back.
Great. Emily?
Well, I'll just say that, you know, what she said, and I think as there's a lot of agreement on these urban design qualities that make better cities, and that's a really good thing. But what we really need to focus on is making it more equitably distributed. And it was interesting during COVID, where all this kind of pedestrian focus was going on in a lot of cities, you know, where people, you know, cities were finally doing what we've been wanting them to do, which is to focus on the public realm and, you know, traffic calming measures and complete streets and all of that. But it was often done in a way that was without community input, and it backfired in some neighborhoods where neighborhoods didn't want any of it. So we need to get better at our process, at our engagement process, but we need to focus on that equitable distribution as we're ramping up a better process.
I'll close on a thought of equity as well in this way, that this kind of urban suburban management with sewers, even if you don't have a UGB or priority funding area, that in the East Coast and California, where I've worked a lot and seen other people, is that the renters are paying a lot. You know, you have gentrification in Bay Area or in DC area where I live now, and renters are being priced out. So this kind of urban containment strategy has increased rent, and that causes redevelopment. But the challenge is that we're not achieving our farmland forest preservation goals. And many of these large lot developments are some of by the richest people. And I just mean upper middle class. I don't mean Jeff Bezos. I just mean that. And so we should be at least trying to extend sewers and into these rural residential areas that are already going to be developed at 2 acres. And in Harford County, One of the people at the National Center for Smart Growth did a project with a series of graduate students, and they worked with the county government in Hartford to, at the edge of the urban growth boundary, to extend sewers out there to build about 13,000 acres to have mixed use development to provide middle-class homes. So at least that should be in the toolbox, and I think people need to be a little bit more open-minded to those type of ideas.
And I'll keep mine brief and mostly encourage you to come back next week to hear about equity and climate change. I appreciate the perspective of these three speakers and hearing about where we are in the first 10 principles. David managed to hit on almost every principle in your closing thoughts, but please join next week to hear more about equity, climate change, energy, and other sorts of things. My colleague Arnab Chakraborty will be the editor representing our team next week. But thank you all again for joining us today.
Great, thank you, Rebecca. And thanks everybody for joining us today. With that, we're going to conclude our webinar, Smart Growth at 25. What have we learned about smart growth principles? I'd like to offer a great big thank you to our panelists for a great presentation, to everyone who attended today, and to John Coleman, our communications and technology guru, who helps to make this all happen and answers your questions during the presentation. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on smartgrowth.org. Also, for those of you who have requested one, all attendees will receive an email that will contain a link to a personalized certificate of participation. Please look for this follow-up email, especially if you need that certificate to claim other credits. When you exit from today's webinar, you'll be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so that we can continue to improve the webinar experience for you. Finally, please keep an eye out on smartgrowth.org and your email inbox for details on other future webinars, including the third part of this webinar series toward a more inclusive and resilient smart growth, which will be next Tuesday, July 27th at 1 p.m. Eastern. With that, wish you all a great day.